Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the lead up to the French Revolution, right? One of Mr. Terry's periods of expertise, one of his places where he loves to just swim in this information and freak out and have all these big moments where he talks about the storming of the Bastille and the failure of the Estates General and blah, 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 blah. But we are going to try our best to keep this flip, even though I love this stuff, we are going to keep it sub 20 minutes to try and stay on that quarter track, that third quarter track of keeping everything nice and short, right? Now, the other big reason why I have to keep it nice and short is mostly due to the fact that it's hard for me to breathe out of my face, right? Because I'm like got some kind of cold or something like that, and it's all Julia Clement's fault. Now, going into it though, let's go ahead and discuss this entire thing and start talking about where we left off in class, right? And we left off in class discussing how divided the French society was at the time. And we actually left off talking about the ancient regime, right? Hey, what are you doing? Let's say, yeah, the ancient regime and also the three estates, right? We talked about how the first estate is the clergy, the second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is, of course, everybody else. I love that joke. All right, so now going into it though, number one, right? Let's go ahead and talk about the first estate really quick and just kind of do a little a bit of a like an overlook of who they are and why this is all such a problem, right? So the first estate, of course, is the clergy. We talked about that a little bit in class, discussing how clergy members, who are all mainly bishops and church leaders, but it even includes priests, abbeys, nuns, things like that. The thing about the problem with their estate is that they are super wealthy, right? Like extremely wealthy, both in monetary value and then also in relic value as well, right? Lots of raw amounts of gold and land also, okay? They're also super wealthy because they collect a tax on everybody every single week, right? 10% of their income, that old fancy thing that y'all know very well, called the tithe, right? And so they pay no taxes on these tithes, no taxes on the land, and speaking of the land, they own 10% of all the land in France, which is absolutely bananas. That would be literally like the Catholic Church owning Texas, right? Like, so like that's absolutely wild how much land they control in this one country, right? And like I said, they pay zero taxes on it, which is a huge issue, okay? Now going into our next society or divided like class, our next estate, we got to discuss the nobility, right? And the nobility is, of course, the second estate, right? And when we talk about the nobles, a big thing to remember is that there are, of course, two types of nobility, right? Who remembers those people? You got the robe and the sword nobles and stuff like that, right? So the nobility, though, the biggest issue with them is they yet again make up a very small percentage of the population of France, a little over 1%, right? There are those two types of them, right? But they also pay taxes on pretty much nothing. They only pay a salt and land tax, right? Which is basically like adds up to just a small percentage of the amount of wealth in France that they actually own, right? And they also collect taxes, which is another really weird situation going on in France. So you have the wealthiest class out of everybody who owns the most amount of land and also who owns the most amount of wealth when it actually comes down to it. They only pay taxes on two things, and they're also employed to collect taxes. So there was this thing in the French government at the time called the Farmers General, and the Farmers General literally farmed out taxes, right? There would be like famous nobles that some of y'all may have learned about if you have chemistry right now. One famous noble being known by the name of Antoine Lavoisier, right? Lavoisier was a famous chemist, right? He was actually one of these people that worked for the Farmers General at one point, and they would go out and collect the taxes from the third estate. And so are we pretty sure that there was some skimming off the top, that there was some enforced labor here? There's this other tax as well that was issued onto the poor people of France known as the corvée, which is super messed up. Sorry about that. For a second, I thought it stopped recording. It's super screwed up because it was literally a forced labor tax. Like if you were going to build a road, you just made the poor people do it, right? So the French nobles, right, of that second estate pay little to no taxes, and they also collect them as well, which is a little bit of a sketchy situation. Now, then we have our third estate, right, who is, of course, known as everybody else, right? But in everybody else, you have to understand that there are several different groups, right? Because this population, or this estate, makes up over 98% of the population of France. If you were born in France in the 1700s or before, the chances of you being born into the third estate is gigantic, right? You had a 98% chance of being born into that estate, okay? And really quickly, though, but since it's so large, sitting here and pretending or acting like all of those people are poor is a little bit of a ridiculous notion, right? So you have to understand that the third estate, since it was so big, was divided into several different subsets, right? Or subclasses, if you will. So within the third estate, we typically look at it as having three different types of people inside of it, right? One being known as the bourgeois, right, or the bourgeoisie, okay, which is a very, very important word that I need you to highlight, okay? The bourgeois or the bourgeoisie is going to be a very, 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 very important word that all of you are probably going to need to know for the rest of your lives, right? Not only because it's a popular last name in Louisiana, but also due to the fact that literally it's the origin of a modern day slang word. When you call someone bougie, you are referring to them as being bourgeois, right? And bourgeois means you had some money, right? So the bourgeois are your prosperous bankers, your merchants, your lawyers, your doctors, your manufacturers, right, who grew or who are a growing wealthy class of people. So something that y'all don't quite understand is that the economic shifts that are going on in the background of this right now is there's a lot of money moving around and a lot of investment going on, right? So the industrial revolution is beginning in Great Britain. They're finding ways, the agricultural revolution is taking hold. People are finding ways to make more profit off of different agricultural processes and also manufacturing processes. So you're seeing some money being injected into this third estate class. But the reason why the bourgeois are so upset is because they're the most heavily taxed group out of all of France, right? And then another heavily taxed group that you have is your rural peasants, right? Which is the bulk of the third estate. Like the chances, like most of the people in the third estate were actually rural peasants, right? And those are farmers, tenant farmers, day laborers, right? People that live in the countrysides of France or nearby small towns in France, and they actually work the land for a living, right? And then you have your urban workers, right? And your urban workers are your poorest of the poor, right? They are the lowest members in the entire society. They are city dwellers, street vendors, sometimes printers, right? But they are people that have begun to urbanize into the cities and begin to move in there due to the agricultural revolution and its effects, right? Excuse me. Needle. Hey, what are you doing? Get out from underneath there. Sorry about that. Pierre was underneath the bed chewing something. Be good. All right, so anyway, now, so going into it, though, you have to understand, they pay high taxes, though, on everything. Whether you are bourgeois, rural, peasant, or urban worker, they paid extremely high taxes on everything, all right? So, like, every single thing they bought, from salt to soap to pork to bread, like, honestly, anything they purchased had a big fat tax on it, right? And so they were getting really, really upset because their labor and their work and their worth was being mined from them via the government at the time, right? And so the thing about it, though, also, is they also were subject to these things called the corvées, right? And the corvées right here is basically a forced labor tax, right? It was this entire system where they could be forced to work on land at any given point, right? And it was not up to them, and it was against their will, okay? So the other thing you have to understand, though, is that Enlightenment ideas are beginning to spread in the background. Because the thing about it, y'all, is that this system has been going on for hundreds of years, right? For centuries, the lower classes, the third estate in France, has been taxed a lot. But what's interesting now is things like the printing press has come to hold, and we also have these Enlightenment thinkers that are beginning to run around and expose the injustices within society at the time, right? And so you see these people like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Diderot with his like actual encyclopedia doing a lot of really important work and exposing the inadequacies of these things, right? They're being like, no, these people are born with rights, right? They deserve to be treated as equals. Your wealth should not demand more rights than other people. That's ridiculous, right? And so these ideas begin to swirl all over France, and particularly in two different locations, right? The rich actually began to meet in places like salons, because this is an important thing that I love to put out there to my students that not everybody else teaches, okay? When this revolution breaks out, it is not the third estate versus everybody else. You got to understand that even a lot of the nobles started realizing that this is a screwed up system, and they're like, this does not make any sense. This is not fair, right? And so they even started having parties known as salons, right? Nobles and wealthy bourgeois members were having parties at their homes in these big, majestic French drawing rooms, which are absolutely gorgeous. And they were known as salons, right? In which they would invite a bunch of people over, right, to hang out, drink wine, and listen to Enlightenment thinkers debate and talk about how they could fix the world and make it a better place, right? And now these ideas, though, from the salons, as we know, ideas spread, right? Because in that room, you know that there are butlers moving around, servants moving around, people that are even from the lower ends and echelons in the urban working classes, or even maybe like related to some of those rural peasants, right? And they start going not to salons because they don't have enough money to go to salons, but they start going to things called coffee houses, right? This whole thing of a coffee house actually started in England, and it was replicated in France, right? And they teamed with the ideas of how monarchs would abuse their power and stuff like that. There were these smoke-filled rooms where people were smoking smoking tobacco and reading newspapers and having ideas of the Enlightenment begin to spread. So you've got an interesting component here, is that the royals and the monarchs who are just like living their lives and doing their own thing are now, they have no idea that people are getting ideas and it's beginning to kind of ferment underneath the surface, right? Now they do notice it a little bit because a lot of illegal like press starts coming out and a lot of illegal literature starts coming out, but still they didn't know it, you know what I mean? So the American Revolution is also going to be another massive reason why this entire thing blows up, right? The French Revolution actually is going to be directly inspired by the American Revolution because the French, one, sent money and troops to the Americans, right? Mostly due to the fact that they hated Britain, right? It's not that they believed in their liberty as much as they were like, hey, England, we hate you. And so they sent money to the Americans for them to revolutionize against them. But they began to idolize people like Thomas Paine and his common sense, and Benjamin Franklin and his ideas. Actually, Benjamin Franklin, after the American Revolution, became like a friggin' celebrity in like France, right? People had his face on towels, they had him on medallions, on decorative plates, and they would hang him all over his house and stuff like that, and be like, they'd just literally be like, oh, Benjamin Franklin, we love him. So yeah, and then literally they thought it was awesome. So much so that it actually drove Louis XVI up a wall, and he had a chamber pot, which is a pot that he goes to the bathroom in, had Benjamin Franklin's face painted on the bottom of it so he could go to the bathroom on his face every day. The French also were inspired, though, by these revolutionary ideas, and you could see them directly inspired by this in one particular figure. Now, Stang, I need you to contain your excitement. Like Cortez, I need you to contain your excitement. But if you've ever heard of this guy before, the Marquis de Lafayette, which I need you to write his name down, this guy is a great interpretation or a great example of literally what the American Revolution did in an inspirational sense, right? The Marquis de Lafayette was one of the French soldiers that went to America to help aid in the revolution and help to actually fight the American Revolution. And he was directly inspired by people like George Washington. And so he brought those ideas back home with him. And he was like, look, if the Americans can do it, we can do it too, right? So which is a really big deal. But the Marquis de Lafayette is going to be a very important person in this whole story. Now, another big reason why this whole thing's going to blow up, and the main reason why this whole thing blows up, we love the Enlightenment, we love the American Revolution, but when you really look at the American Revolution, it's all about the financial issues it caused, right? You have to understand that France was in crippling amounts of debt, right? Crippling amounts of debt, because like they had so many troubles when it came to money. And it was caused by deficit spending mostly, okay? So deficit spending is a term that we use in historical analysis and also in economics to discuss when a government spends more than it earns, right? Which you could actually argue is what, most modern day governments do in the modern era, right? Like they're going into debt, like these debt counters are crazy, right? So the thing about it that you have to understand is that during this time period though, in the 1700s, deficit spending is a problem because these loans are accruing a buttload of interest, right? And since national debt is at an all-time high, the interest is going up and up and up. Now, I'll explain how interest works and stuff like that in class if you don't already know what it is, just because it's important for you to know as a common day life skill to know what the heck interest is, right? So now, because literally 50%, y'all, I need you to highlight this statistic right here in the middle, is so important because 50% of all the money that was collected in France due to taxes or from taxes was going to pay just the interest on those loans. And when you pay interest, y'all, you don't see any return on that money. It's like literally setting it on fire, right? So literally 50% of all their tax money was paying interest on debts. And then couple that with another huge problem. The poor are being affected because of bad harvests. There were several seasons in a row that was actually causing wheat crop failures, and what that's leading to is a rise in bread prices, right? Now, bread was a very, very essential nutritional thing in the France at the time. Everybody would basically buy a 4-pound loaf of it, right? A 4-pound loaf of bread, and they'd feed their family for an entire week on it. Now, when you look at the price fluctuations at this 4-pound loaf of bread, it's really important to realize that this directly affected the poor community aggressively. Because at one point, leading up to the revolution, bread cost as much as a person would make in a week, right? Which is insane because you still have other bills, you know what I mean? But you still got to feed your family. So when also we see this, you could even see apparently bakers in France started mixing in terrible ingredients with this bread, trying to make it stretch further, right? And so a very common thing to actually mix with the black bread at the time of the French Revolution was this stuff known as sawdust, which of course literally comes off wood, right? Which is really, really gross when you think about it. And also during this whole problem, bad harvests, 50% of the tax money going to pay interest on loans, the first and second estate are still refusing to pay higher taxes. Because something that you have to understand about Louis, right? Louis did try to prevent this revolution. He just was bad at it, right? Like, so he hired several different finance ministers, including Brienne, Cologne, Turgot, like several different figures that came in and they were like, oh, well, we should just change the tax code and we should go to a free market. And if we do a free market, we should tax people's profits, right? And they wanted to kind of create a new system to make this all work. And so they even called some early on meetings like the Assembly of Notables, but these rich people still refused to pay more in taxes, right? Because some of them were like, yes, we should do this, but the bulk of them were still like, no, I don't want to do that, right? And so what you have to understand is, back against a wall, since all of his ideas were failing and all of his finance ministers were failing, they decided to call this thing known as the Estates General, right? Now in 1788, actually, like they decide to call it, and then in March of 1789, it begins, right? And so Louis XVI calls this thing known as the Estates General. The Estates General is a council of representatives from each estate, not state, estate, all about financial reform. Basically, it's an emergency parliament. Imagine if the parliament was only called if the country was about to descend into madness, right? So like, no, that's basically what the Estates General is. It is a catch-all. It is a preventative. It is a thing that literally is supposed to make sure that this place doesn't blow up, right? So like now, and what ends up happening though is it does not go the way they wanted to, but he finally hires a very important guy, a guy named Jacques Necker, right? Jacques Necker is a Swiss finance minister who's like, the only way you're going to fix this problem is if you call the Estates General and you make the first and second estate start paying more in taxes. It's the only way you're going to do it, right? And so what ends up going down, though, is the Estates General hadn't met since 1614, over 150 years. This is a sign of how awful the finances were of France, right? Because like I said, 1789 is when the revolution begins, and when they actually called the next Estates General, 1614 is the last time they did it. And the last time it happened was when Louis XVI's great-great-great-grandfather, Louis XIII, did it, right? So the thing about it that you have to understand about the Estates General, right, is it does have several different goals, all right? So looking at the goals of the Estates General, you have to understand, one, they want to reform the tax laws, right? They want to solve the financial crisis. And then there's some agreement there as well. There's some people that are like, oh, we should definitely go to a constitutional monarchy. Absolutism is failing. And then the third, first, and second say, we're all like, yeah, that's a great idea. But so you have to understand, though, they were disrespected on day one. When I say disrespect on day one, the third estate was miserably disrespected the second they got there, right? They literally had to wear black robes. There was this whole entrance thing. We'll talk about it in class. And there was also one giant, glaring, holy crap problem. And that problem was that each estate only got one vote. So regardless of how many members you sent to the Estates General, you each only got one vote. So the first estate over here got one vote, the second estate over here got one vote, and the third estate over here got one vote. So when it came to like constitutional monarchy, they all voted in unanimity to do it, right? But then when tax reform issues came up, do you think the first and second estate are going to cast their ballot to pay more money? I don't think so. So the third estate kept getting outnumbered, right? And so it led to huge issues and an overall failure of this meeting, okay? But we're going to pick up right there in class and talk more about this and why this failure will lead to riot in the first instances of violence in the Revolution of 1789. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.